Some leaders preach peace. Others promise paradise at a price. In Waco, Texas, a man named David Koresh turned prophecy into power and power into control. To his followers, he was a chosen messenger. To the outside world, he was a dangerous manipulator at the center of one of the most infamous standoffs in American history. This is the story of how one man led the Branch Davidians to their fiery fate, and the warning it leaves behind. The sound of doors. They called him David long before the papers printed Koresh like a brand, and long before the television trucks turned the frontage roads into a necklace of antennas and diesel fumes. In the early evenings, when the Texas sky went copper and violet at once, the chapel inside Mount Carmel smelled of wood polish and warm dust. Doors sighed on their hinges. Pages turned. Voices layered like wind. He stood at the front in a simple shirt, the kind anyone could buy at the strip mall in town, and spoke from a Bible that had been read so fiercely, its margins looked like a battlefield of notes. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice had a cadence that leaned forward, then paused just enough to make you lean too. Ruth remembered the first night she brought her daughter, Naomi. They'd arrived just before prayer, and the children drifted to one side like a school of small fish, giggling in a language only children keep perfectly. Ruth heard the old hymns, nothing forbidden about the melodies, and caught phrases about seals and trumpets, and a vision that was not the kind with neon lights, but the kind that lives in your chest. People in folding chairs nodded. People who worked odd jobs in town during the day, who brought casseroles and ceramic dishes that would never be claimed once things turned bad. People who paid their bills and bought gas and laughed at the store, then drove back to the property as if crossing a river invisible to everyone else. If you came looking for menace, you wouldn't find it in a Tuesday night choir practice. You'd find a boy with a chipped tooth trying to hit the high notes from a cassette tape, a young woman tracing lines of scripture with a cracked pink nail, a mechanic asleep with a Bible open on his lap, grease under his fingernails like a permanent signature. You'd find folks who believed they'd found a key. But the world beyond the door had ears. Stories travel faster than any song. Stories about prophecy and control, about marriages that didn't look like the kind downtown, about weapons purchased legally until questions steamed off them like heat. The words compound and cult began to eclipse church and community. There were rumors and affidavits and neighbors nervous in the checkout line. Someone said the music went all night. Someone said there were plans for the end, as if the end were a party whose invitations had been mailed. David stood at the front and read from Revelation, his forefinger under each verse like a carpenter measuring. He spoke about seals opened by a lamb and about a world that sang to the wrong kings. He used words like types and anti-types, history folding over on itself like bread dough. Ruth wasn't a scholar. She was a mother with a paycheck that evaporated by Wednesday. Still, she felt something in those pauses, the way a snow globe looks solid until you shake it. She did not see a tyrant. She saw a man who wept during prayer. She saw a room trying to be a harbor. At home, the television murmured another America, a city where the camera positioned itself at the anchor's left shoulder and told her what she was supposed to have learned in civics, that America would soon train its lens on Waco, on a patch of Texas that had always been wide enough to swallow a secret. The anchor's voice was clinical. The map was a rectangle. The words investigation and alleged and firearms and children began to cluster in sentences like barbed wire. No one saw the story as a single door. They saw their own entrance, a hymn book, an affidavit, a memo, a whispered warning at a diner, a nurse noting a bruise that might have come from a ladder, or might not have. The wind across the prairie did not choose a side. It simply kept moving. Somewhere in town, an agent sharpened a pencil. Somewhere at Mount Carmel, a child snuck an extra cookie. Somewhere in between, the road thought nothing as tires pressed it thin. "Listen," David told them, turning another page. "The first seal is not the last word." He said it almost gently. Ruth squeezed Naomi's hand, not because she understood prophecy, but because she understood hands. The doors sighed again. The choir tried the chorus once more. And evening folded its copper into violet, the way stories fold into other stories when more people arrive to tell them. The weight of paper. Special Agent Morales had a stack of documents on his desk heavy enough to leave a geometric bruise. He knew their grammar by heart. It is alleged. Witness states, observed and on or about. He also had a daughter the same age as the ones he saw on school picture day, teeth imperfect, bangs cut by moms with trembling hands. He kept her photo propped against a mug with a chip on the rim. The crack was shaped like a question mark. The briefing room smelled of coffee that had been brave a few hours ago. A whiteboard scrawled with names, dates, delivery addresses. Legal purchases were still purchases. Reports were still reports. Complaints collected like drizzle. Some were likely truth. Some were almost certainly not. If Morales had learned anything, it was that truth got confused when fear arrived with its friends. Urgency and pride. They discussed timing. They discussed dogs and gates and wind direction. They discussed a floor plan the way a surgeon discusses bone. He nodded when he was supposed to nod. He asked, "What about the kids?" And got the answer he knew he would get. "We have protocols." He drove the perimeter twice, once in silence, once with a country station humming the ache of someone else's loss. The road to Mount Carmel stretched in an honest line, past fields that nodded in a language of seeds. He parked at a distance and watched through binoculars. He saw set routines, men with pallets, a boy on a bike, a woman carrying laundry like a flag of ordinary life. It did not match the uglier narratives in his folder, and yet the folder didn't vanish because he wished it to. The weight of paper is not in its ounces, but in its consequences. In the motel room, he ironed his shirt, like a man preparing for a job interview. He called home. His daughter told him they'd studied the Bill of Rights and asked him which one was his favorite. "The fourth," he said, because that had been the lesson, and because it meant something about doors and warrants and the way a person's home was supposed to be a castle. He heard himself say it, and wished that ideals could be folded and unfolded like shirts. The morning of the operation, the sky looked emptied of color, as if the air itself didn't want to commit. The convoy formed up with an unromantic efficiency, like someone building a sentence out of nouns. Morales checked his gear and his radio. He was a professional, not a cowboy. He repeated the word serve in his head. The service of a warrant, the service of law, the service owed to children he'd never met. He repeated it until it felt less like a word and more like a rhythm he could keep time to. He had been in rooms that suddenly became hallways of noise. He had heard the crack of decisions made 2 weeks ago reaching across space to explode in a doorway. He knew the way ladders feel soft and then dangerously alive under boots. He knew the stubborn physics of panic. He also knew that when plans were explained in bullet points on a board, the bullets felt very far away. Someone joked in the staging area, because gallows humor is a kind of weather that follows certain jobs. Morales didn't join. He looked at a photograph clipped to the file. The man in it wasn't smiling. He wasn't snarling either. He looked like someone caught between errands. The caption might as well have read, "Human, complicated." The world outside the frame insisted on sharper categories. He knew there were people inside who believed the world would end in flame and that it would be proof, not tragedy. He knew there were people outside who believed a measured use of force could end a story cleanly. He also knew that when a story had been written by enough hands, gossip, grief, bureaucracy, hunger for airtime, it stopped belonging to any one of them. It belonged to the outcome. They rolled. Tires whispered. Radios scratched. Someone's throat cleared loud over the net. Morales felt in the cage of his ribs a hope he wouldn't have admitted aloud, that the doors would open to paperwork and voices and nothing worse. Hope, he'd learned, is also a protocol. It goes in first. Broadcast hours. The first TV truck to arrive didn't look like a vulture. It looked like a box with ambition. Allison, who had learned to say "live from" with the quick confidence required of a woman who'd had mics checked by men half listening for static, stepped down into warm wind and the smell of mesquite. She smoothed her blazer and scanned the horizon. There was, to be honest, not much to see. Land, a building that had the blankness of practical places, and a sky big enough to fit opinion pieces inside. But TV knows how to make a stage where there is only floor. Her producer wanted angles. Her station manager wanted graphics with a serif heavy enough to suggest authority. The national shows would want an anchor's eyebrow raised just so. Allison wanted, secretly, the luxury of time. But time is the enemy of broadcast because it lets nuance wander in. The story had unspooled quickly. Allegations, a raid attempted, shots fired, people wounded, then the siege, and with it, a new vocabulary. Negotiations, tear gas, deadlines, delays. The cameras multiplied like mirrors facing one another. The news cycle began to circle, a carousel with every horse calling itself the lead. She filed pieces that felt like postcards from a complicated town. A pastor talked about sheep and shepherds without mentioning names. A gun store owner polished a display while speaking in generalities about rights and responsibilities. A woman at a diner poured coffee and did not hide the way her eyes kept one corner of the room under surveillance, as if trouble could be poured too. She kept thinking of the word apocalypse. It means revelation, an unveiling. But on the air, it had been reduced to fireworks. The satellite uplink hummed. The red light above the camera's lens was an unblinking pupil. We're learning tonight. Sources tell us community members are divided. Each phrase was a suitcase into which she had to pack too much. Off camera, she could say, it's complicated. On camera, complicated becomes developing, which suggests that clarity is just over the next hill. At the perimeter, she watched agents in dark jackets speak in the efficient dialect of people who can't afford metaphor. Across the field, she saw the building scabbed with plywood and prayer. A negotiator's voice crawled along a phone line, asking for assurances, promising others. Songs rose from inside some evenings. Hymns, fragments of psalms, sometimes the rhythm of a drum that didn't sound like anyone's scheduled heartbeat. Allison made notes she could not use. How the prairie light went sudden gold at 6:18 p.m. How a stray dog made friends with a cameraman. How the word children hung in every conversation, like a lit match held just short of a fuse. One night she interviewed a former member who spoke about charisma like a weather pattern. You don't feel drenched, the woman said. You just realize you're soaked. Another afternoon, she spoke with a federal spokesperson who wore tired like a wristwatch and said carefully, "We are committed to a peaceful resolution." She believed he believed it. She also knew that belief is a currency that inflates in crises. Her mother called to tell her to be careful. Her brother texted a joke about barbecue. Allison thought of the people inside, how their days must feel like a tight hallway, how the memory of a casserole brought by a neighbor could now feel like a myth from another civilization. She thought of the people outside, how each night in a motel or a field chair or a command post multiplied fatigue into stubbornness. Then she went live again. "Good evening," she said, the teleprompter moving in its smooth scroll. "We begin with the standoff outside Waco," and watched her own face in a monitor become part of the event. Broadcast hours stretched, then snapped back. The story didn't care how you told it. It cared how it ended. The longest negotiation. Hale, the FBI negotiator, kept a legal pad divided into columns. What they want, what we can give, what we need, what we can't say. He had the kind of voice that could talk a ledge into looking like a balcony. He also had tinnitus that sang in the quiet hours like a far-off kettle. In the command post, the air filtered to a public building neutrality. He listened to recorded sermons and phone calls, trying to map a mind that spoke in parables. He respected parables. They are strategy in story form. But strategy does not hustle a clock. Sometimes the voice on the line was David's. Sometimes it was someone else's. A lieutenant, a wife, a teenage boy who sounded like he had swallowed a radio announcer and was trying to speak around it. They asked for food. They asked to broadcast messages, for paper and pens, for promises he couldn't make. He asked for children, for steps that would walk this toward daylight. More than once, someone inside sang a verse of a hymn down the wire as if to say, "We are people. Don't make this a chessboard." Hale made a deal, recorded sermons in exchange for releases. Sometimes it worked. A handful would step out and blink at the brutal generosity of sunlight. Others stayed, knit to one another by a doctrine that had become daily bread. He knew from training that in groups like this, identity calcifies under pressure. A siege turns time into a furnace, and people into what they believe they must be to survive it. Martyr, protector, prophet, faithful remnant. The world outside drew its own roles: rescuer, lawgiver, judge, critic, mourner in waiting. "Look," Hale said in a meeting, drawing circles that overlapped and messily did not. "We're not only negotiating with one man, we're negotiating with a system of meaning." He tried metaphors and dropped them. Plain talk sometimes traveled farther. If we shove, they'll brace. If we listen, time might unstring this. The tactical team listened and didn't argue, but their mandate had a different clock. He knew the tension wasn't personal. It was physics. Two solutions occupying the same narrow hallway. He spoke with a released woman who said her heart felt like a bird tossed between windows. He spoke with a psychologist who said the human need for certainty can turn even suffering into a kind of shelter if it's painted with purpose. He rehearsed phrases that might buy a day, an hour, 5 minutes. "I hear you. We can work with that. Help me understand." He said them sincerely. Sincerity was a tool and also a truth. When the loudspeakers went up, the landscape changed. Music blasted. Pop songs meant to erode concentration. Nursery rhymes bent into irritants. Tanks moved with the ugly poetry of heavy things. Hale argued for quiet, and sometimes got it, sometimes not. He felt the story slipping away from the patient verbs. The pad in front of him became a field of crossed-out bargains. Some nights, he dreamed he was on hold, light jazz looping while a voice said, "Your call matters to us." Other nights, he dreamed of a chapel with doors sighing on their hinges, and people who wanted to love God in a way that made sense of their private storms. He knew not to romanticize. He knew there were harms in there, coercions dressed as commandments, arrangements that skewed power and called it revelation. He knew that the children inside did not choose doctrine like a wardrobe, yet he also knew that the bluntness of force writes its own dark scripture. The morning decisions hardened. He held the phone like a relic and asked again, "Let the children out first." The answer braided conviction and fear. "We can't," the voice said. "It's all of us or none." Hale tried a dozen keys. The lock had welded itself into a symbol. When the canisters rolled, he wrote in the corner of the pad, "We didn't run out of words. We ran out of time." He would carry that line like a pebble in his shoe, a small pain you get used to and never quite stop feeling. After. Smoke is its own kind of sentence. It begins with a subject and ends with a silence. The day the fire took the building, the wind carried pieces that might have been song and might have been paperwork. The cameras caught orange the way cameras always do, too beautiful for what it means. The words tragic and horrific and unthinkable entered a chorus that was sung by people who had already thought of these things many times. Sirens stitched the field with sound. Faces became unreadable. The prairie looked like it had been asked a question and refused to answer. Afterward is strange. It's bureaucratic and sacred in the same hour. There are reports to write, and bodies to count, and names that once belonged to people in choir practice that become items in a ledger. There are funerals without clear lines between public and private. There are opinion pieces written by people who were certain before they understood anything. There are books and hearings and apologies that arrive like weather, sometimes necessary, sometimes too late, sometimes both. Ruth moved through her kitchen like it belonged to someone who had been gone a long time. Naomi asked if the people were with God now, and Ruth said, because she could not say anything else, "I hope so." She kept the hymn cassette, even though she no longer had a player. She kept a recipe card in someone's handwriting that leaned to the right. Some afternoons she drove past the field and sat in the car with the window down, as if listening might let the ground tell her what to do with her anger. Anger, her guilt for having left, her guilt for having stayed as long as she did. Grief, she learned, is a map that refuses scale. Everything feels both 5 steps and 5 states away. Agent Morales stood in a suit in front of a panel months later and answered questions that had been sharpened by time. He spoke carefully, as you do around explosives. He said what he had seen and what he had not, and what he had assumed and what he now wished he had questioned harder. He went home and watched his daughter fall asleep with a book on her chest and felt something crack that had been keeping him upright. The crack wasn't fatal. It was a place where light could get in, to borrow a line he could not place. He knew people wanted villains and heroes. He suspected they were stuck, like him, in a story full of flawed witnesses. Allison filed her last piece from the site and rolled up the cable with a grace that came from repetition. In the end, she said into a lens that made everything seem clean, the questions remain. She meant it. She was tired of the way certainty is purchased wholesale by those far enough from the smoke to keep their shirts clean. She went home and took a long shower and dreamed of doors sighing on their hinges. The next week, she covered a school board meeting, and the weather turned unseasonably kind. Hale taught a course on negotiations the following year, and when a student asked what you do when the other side believes the end of the world is an hour away, he said, "You don't make yourself the proof of their prophecy." He wished the answer were stronger. He wished he had a formula. He added, "You look for the human under the armor, and you try to be the human under yours." He did not mention the legal pad pebble in his shoe. He did not mention the dreams. He did not need to. Some truths don't require microphones. History will file the event under dates and casualty counts, under abbreviations and partial reconstructions. People will argue about blame with charts and agency acronyms. Others will gather quietly and say names under their breath like prayer. A child will grow up and realize their birthday is close to the day the smoke rose, and they'll wonder what it means to be tied to a calendar like that. Someone will move to Waco for a job and only later learn the road they take to the grocery store used to be a route for cameras and convoys. The prairie will do what prairies do, hold what we put on it, seeds and stories alike. New grass will insist on being green because that's its only job. The wind will keep not choosing sides. A mother will carry grief like a small stone that never leaves her pocket. An agent will stand at his sink and say a name quietly. A reporter will pause before going live when a siren passes, because memory makes its own producers. A negotiator will write on a fresh pad what they want, what we can give, and leave room for the column that takes a lifetime to fill. What we learned. If there is a lesson, it is not a slogan. It is breath. It is the way doors sound when they open and when they close, and the reverence owed to spaces where people believe they are safe, no matter how peculiar, no matter how unlikely, no matter how we label them later in our tidy fonts. It is that fire ends things and yet reveals that revelation is not always salvation, that the human under all the armor is the only one who can choose not to light the match. It is that communities can tangle themselves in meanings too tight to untie, and that help, when it arrives, must be patient enough not to become the thing it fears. The story will be told again, each time with a different door at the start. Some will open into hymnals, some into warrants, some into satellite trucks. All will open into rooms with human voices. If there is mercy to be invented, it might live in the pause before we step through, listening long enough to learn where we are and who else is there, and whether the floor we're about to cross was built for the weight of what we carry. 5 ways he could have gotten away with his crimes. For educational purposes, to understand how law enforcement and the public can prevent such cases in the future. Kept a lower public profile. Avoiding media interviews and provocative public statements could have delayed scrutiny. Avoided stockpiling weapons. Without the firearms accumulation, federal attention might not have escalated so quickly. Maintained more conventional social structures. Eliminating unorthodox and coercive relationships could have reduced allegations of abuse. Integrated with the local community, building alliances outside the group may have provided social cover and diluted suspicion. Limited the apocalyptic rhetoric. Dialing down end times predictions in public sermons could have avoided confirming outsiders' worst fears. 5 questions for the audience. Encourage engagement. Answers in the comments. Do you think the Waco siege could have ended peacefully if negotiations had gone differently? Was Koresh more dangerous because of his beliefs or his charisma? How much did media coverage influence the outcome of the siege? Could the Branch Davidians have survived if Koresh had stepped down as leader? Was law enforcement justified in their approach, or did they escalate the situation? Support Screw Crime. Cash App, $Forest Job. PayPal, A Divine Destiny, LLC@gmail.com. Subscribe for more true crime stories.